Good morning. We will pay attention to the general ledger when the opening balances are provided. They gave us the opening balances on the 1st of May 2016. Cash, vehicles, land and equipment, all of them are assets, so they all have debit balances. So if we add all the assets together, we can determine what is the value of the capital, because capital will be equal to all the assets. Mr. Peterson deposited 20,000 Rand in the current account of the business to increase his capital contribution. Okay, so first of all, the business receives money, so the one double entry will be in the bank account. Why do they receive the money? To increase capital, so the double entry will be in the capital account. The balances that were provided will be entered in the ledger accounts at the beginning of the month, and then we will start recording the other entries. On the 1st, the owner increased the capital. Bank is an asset. Assets increase on the debit side and decrease on the credit side. Therefore, the bank will be debited with the 20,000, and we will indicate that the capital account will be credited with the 20,000. And in capital, we will show that the bank was debited. Capital is equity. Equity increases on the credit side and decrease on the debit side. Check 88 for 25,000 was issued for extensions to the buildings. We paid by check, so the one entry will be in the bank account. We had extensions to the buildings, so the value of our buildings increased, so the buildings will be the double entry. Land and buildings is an asset. Assets increase on the debit side, decrease on the credit side. So the land will increase on with the 25,000 to indicate that the value of land after the extensions is now 145,000. And we will show that this double entry was completed in the bank account. We've taken money out of the bank, so the asset decreases on the credit side. Paid Maggie suppliers 8,500 for service material purchase. We paid money, so the one entry will be in the bank. We purchased service material that we will use in the business, so materials will be the double entry. Money was taken out of the bank, so the bank decreases on the credit side with 8,500, and the material account will be debited. Material is an expense. Expenses increase on the debit side, decrease on the credit side, so the material expense increases on the debit side, and the bank was credited. Additional equipment was purchased on credit for 4,900. We received equipment, so the one ledger account will be equipment. We bought on credit, and we buy from Milan Traders, that is our creditor, because we owe them money, so that will be our double entry. Equipment will be debited with 4,900 because we bought additional equipment. Equipment is an asset that increases on the debit side and decreases on the credit side. We bought the equipment on credit, so Milan Traders will be credited. Milan Traders is a creditor, therefore a liability. Liabilities increase on the credit side and decrease on the debit side. We owe more money to Milan Traders, so the liability must increase on the credit side, and equipment was debited. Cash received for services rendered according to the cash register roll. We receive cash, so the one entry will be in the bank. Where did we get the money from? The services rendered. So services rendered will be my double entry. The bank account is debited with 16,840 because the money in the bank increased, and we will credit services rendered. Services rendered is an income. Income increases on the credit side and decrease on the debit side. So services rendered increased our income on the credit side, and the bank was debited. Wages paid by check. Money was taken out of the bank. What did we pay? Wages. The bank account will be credited with the 800 to decrease the money in the bank, and the wages account will be debited. Wages is expense. Expenses increase on the debit side and decrease on the credit side. So the expense is increased with 800 on the debit side, bank account credited. Issued a check to pay for this electricity. Money was taken from the bank and electricity was paid. The bank account will be credited with 140 to decrease the money in the bank, and the electricity account will be debited. Electricity is an expense that increases on the debit side and decreases on the credit side. So expenses increased with 140 and the bank account was credited. Stationery was purchased on credit for 280. The one account will be stationery that we purchased. We bought it on credit. So we buy from a creditor. We didn't take money, so it will not go into the bank account. It will go in Trick Store's account or creditor's control. Trick Stores is a creditor that increases on the credit side. So we will increase the liability with 280, and we show that stationery was debited with 280 rand. Stationery is the expense that increases on the debit side. A receipt was issued to Protea Florist for rent received. Money was received, so the one entry will be in the bank and the double entry will be in rent received. The money in the bank increased with 200 rand and rent income will be credited with 200. Rent income is credited with 200 because income increases on the credit side and the bank account was debited. According to the cash register roll, money was received for services rendered. So it means we received cash, so the bank account will be debited and services rendered will be credited. The money in the bank increased with the money that we received. The income in the business increased with 1,920 and the bank account was debited. Issued a check to Telkom to pay the telephone account. We've taken money out of the bank, so the one entry will be in the bank account. We paid for telephone, so the double entry will be in the telephone account. The bank account is credited because we reduced the money in the bank when we paid for the telephone, and the telephone account will be debited. Telephone is an expense that increases on the debit side, and it increased my expenses with 120 rand. At the end of the month, we will balance our accounts. If there are two amounts on the same side, we will add up to see what is the total amount that will be recorded in the trial balance. If the amount is on the credit side, it will be shown on the credit side of the trial balance. Land and buildings only amounts on the debit side, so I added, and the 145,000 total amount will be recorded on the trial balance on the debit side. The same with the equipment. Vehicles, we only have one amount, so this amount will go on the debit side of my trial balance. In the bank account, we've got amounts on the debit side and the credit side, so we have to work out a balancing figure. The debit side is bigger than the credit side, so I will add up the debit side, all the amounts on the debit side, then I will take the total on the debit side and I will subtract all the amounts on the credit side to determine the balancing figure. And the balancing figure will then be entered on the side that's smallest, and we will show that that is the balance that we carry down. After I entered the balance above the total, all the amounts on the credit side will equal the total on the debit side, and we will always have the two totals on the same line, and there will never be any words next to the totals, and the two totals must always be the same. And we will bring down that balance on the opposite side on the first day of the next month. Because the balance was brought down on the debit side, we will record this balance on the debit side of the trial balance. If we look at the trial balance, we see that capital balances was on the credit side. So the amount on the credit side of your capital account will appear on the credit side of the trial balance. All my assets, land and buildings, equipment, vehicles, the amounts were on the debit side, so the balances will appear on the debit side of the trial balance. The bank account we had to balance because there were amounts on the debit and credit side. The balance brought down below the total was on the debit side. Therefore, I will show that balance on the debit side. Then I will add up all my other accounts, and if the amounts are on the credit side, I record it on the credit side of the trial balance. If the amounts are on the debit side in the ledger accounts, we will show it on the debit side. To check yourself after you entered all these balances, you know that capital must always have a credit balance. Any liabilities must have credit balances. So there's my liabilities. And all my assets must have debit balances. All my expenses must have debit balances. Income will have credit balances. So when I'm finished with the trial balance, I just check and ensure that the capital, liabilities, and income is on the credit side. Assets and expenses are on the debit side. And if we made no mistakes, the total on the debit side and the total on the credit side will be the same.